Condoleezza Rice with the blood on her hands and said to her in the middle of the hearing, where all of the cameras were snapping away, said to Condoleezza Rice, "The blood of the Iraqi people is on your hands. You are a war criminal." And as the police dragged Desiree Firouz out of the hall of Congress, the last thing you could hear Desiree say is, "Take Condi Rice to The Hague." A wonderful message that got across on C-SPAN and CNN and many of the network news on that day. But perhaps the most beautiful thing, and this happens a lot with what Code Pink does, is the word gets out around the rest of the world. And this picture, for example, was on the front page in papers from China to Indonesia to Japan to Brazil, and we were inundated in the Code Pink house with thanks from people around the world saying, "It is wonderful to see that there is life in the United States and that there are some people standing up to the horrible policies of George Bush." While we are dead serious, as many of you are, about our work to stop war, we also believe in using art as a way to get our message across, using culture, using beauty, using joy. And so here are just some photos of ways that Code Pink tries to inject some fun into the movement, some spirit, some beauty, some joy. These are some tanks that we have taken over and turned them into some pink tanks. Wonderful. This is from the Orcas Island that does a wonderful pink parade and showed us how you can bring the whole family out to these things, even the dog. Intergenerational. And what always keeps us going is to remember who we are doing this for. We're doing this for the next generation. We're doing this for the future generations. And I want to stop here and talk about how it's the future generations of human beings that we're doing this for, but while we're here at a Green Festival, it is for the future of the planet. And when I started out, I talked about two separate movements that we have. One, a peace movement, and one, an environmental movement. A peace movement that has become very tired after over 5 years of fighting an administration and a Congress that doesn't listen to us. A peace movement that has seen that our democracy is terribly broken when for the last several years we have managed to win over public opinion in this country, and yet we have not managed to have our elected leaders do what the majority of people want them to do. A peace movement that wonders, does it make sense for me to go out to another demonstration? Does it make sense for me to go out to another weekly peace vigil? Is anybody in elected office going to care? And then on the other hand, we have an environmental movement that's full of energy, that's full of life, that's full of spirit, that sees that the questioning earlier years about whether global warming even existed is now gone, that people are now in the phase of finding solutions to global warming. And as we see here in the Green Festival, all the excitement, all the creativity, all the know-how being put into this positive movement of creating something new and sustainable and beautiful for the next phase of this planet. So our job is to think of how can we take the excitement of the environmental movement and inject it into a peace movement that needs some of that spirit. Let's remember that war is not green. Let's remember that war is the ultimate in ecocide. That you can look at what has happened in Iraq and see the devastation of the environment dating back from the Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein demanded that his retreating troops destroy the oil fields of Kuwait, and the spills of oil there were deemed to be 20 times that of the oil spill of the Exxon Valdez. And then going back to the Gulf War, the use of depleted uranium, the thousands, tons of depleted uranium that the United States and the United Kingdom dropped on Iraq, dating back from the first Gulf War to this one. And in fact, when I was doing some research on that, one of the best pieces that was done in the mainstream media was actually done by the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. There was a study of depleted uranium, and they even, because the U.S. government failed to admit the ruinous effects of depleted uranium on the soil, on the environment, on the health of the birds, of the water, and of the human beings, did their own study and tested the areas where the U.S. had dropped depleted uranium, brought it back to the cancer research here in Seattle to see the tremendous lethal effects of depleted uranium. I got to see it firsthand and personal when I went to the hospitals in Baghdad and in southern Iraq in Basra, where the cancer rate is now 600 times what it was in 1990. And all of the doctors there attribute this to the use of depleted uranium. You see the most horrible birth defects that you'd ever want to see. Children born with their intestines hanging out of their bodies. Children born with one eye that makes them look like a cyclops, or with no eyes at all. And the leukemia rates among children have skyrocketed. The use of depleted uranium is expected to affect Iraq for decades and decades to come. And the depleted uranium that was dropped in this invasion of 2003, because it has a 5-year cycle to incubation period, we are just starting to see the effects now in 2008. We also see the devastation of the environment from the oil fields that are being blown up by all sides, constant oil spills, and by the destruction of the infrastructure from the U.S. invasion that destroyed the sewer system, so that you have now dirty water, polluted water that is being consumed by the Iraqi population, and as a result, infant mortality has skyrocketed. You see also the devastation that is wrought by the lack of electricity. That means that the hospitals barely function. We have to understand that the environment and the human catastrophe of the invasion of Iraq. But we have to also put this in a larger context, and that's the context of our overconsumption of oil, being 5% of the world's population and consuming 25% of the resources. And what we see at this Green Festival and the ideas that are coming out to change our patterns and our addiction to oil is part of a movement to move the U.S. from being the empire that feels that it has the right to take over other people's oil, to take over other people's resources, merely because we have the power to do that. And this phase of our history, this phase of living in the empire, is a phase that means that we, as part of seeking solutions, are part of a movement that is trying to turn the United States from an empire into a democracy, because you can't have both at the same time. For those of you who don't understand the extent of this empire, it is quite astounding. There are a couple of other countries in the world that have military bases overseas. They are, for example, France, China, Russia, England, Italy, but the United States accounts for 95% of the foreign bases overseas. We have over 700 bases in 130 countries. Not counting the U.S. troops that we have in the Middle East and Afghanistan, there are 500,000 military that are in these foreign bases.